Hey everyone, Chat Cemetery is back, as is Murjani Rawls. Today we're talking all about the 1999 movie, The Rage, Carrie 2. Yes, it did take 23 years to make a sequel to the original Carrie, and the only reason this is really a sequel is because they literally show flashbacks to Carrie White and bring back Amy Irving as Sue Snell, and they just throw a couple bones so that it ties in, and obviously not directly based on any of Stephen King's source material. But Murjani, how do you feel overall about this sequel?
I think I saw it like maybe on like HBO a long time ago, or like one of those channels like TNT or USA. So it was, like those Saturday afternoon like kind of things where you're just like, oh, I'm not doing nothing, I'm just gonna watch this random movie. And then I saw it there, I'm like, oh, there's a Carrie sequel. Basically, kind of rewatching this, I didn't really feel like it was a true Carrie sequel. Well, like for one, Stephen King didn't write a second book.
Yeah.
So it just kind of like ended. Like we've been on here and we've talked like basically like Children of the Corn 2 and kind of adapting plot lines, which they don't really have a plot line from Stephen King. I felt like this was more of a teen drama Lifetime movie, and then there was like Carrie sprinkled in. Like, it was just like, oh, by the way, like, here's some Carrie stuff. There's telekinesis. There's the legend. There, you know what I mean? Like, there's... I didn't think it was... I was fonder, a little bit more fonder this time around than seeing it initially. But, like, like, I didn't think that it was as bad as some of the other Stephen King sequels. I know, like, that's a low bar to kind of raise, but, like...
Especially in the 90s.
Yeah, I didn't think it was that bad, especially because it's like based on like an actual true story of this 1993 incident with like they're called the Spur Posse, who was like involved in like some sex scandal or whatnot. But like, yeah, I didn't think it was that bad.
Same, and fun little fact here, this movie was actually called The Curse to begin with, and it was put on pause, and then they sort of turned it into a Stephen King sequel, which is then when it became The Rage, Carrie 2, and you kind of get a sense that this has happened a few times now. I recently talked about Sometimes They Come Back for More, which is the third of the Sometimes They Come Back movies, and that was actually titled Frozen to begin with, which was kind of a weird thing that popped up on screen when Jonathan Watkins and I both watched it. And you get a sense that sometimes these sequels kind of just want Stephen King's name attached to them so that they actually get made. And I'm not saying that this movie was so bad it shouldn't have been made or anything, because I thought it was a perfectly fine movie and a concept for a movie, regardless of the Carrie connection. And I think that sort of just gave it this little push that it needed to get to the finish line and actually get released. But, I mentioned Amy Irving coming back, and obviously she could have been in this movie without the Carrie connection, and she just wouldn't have been named Sue Snell for her character. And I think with a good majority of the cast, you do have some familiar TV names. You have Dylan Bruno, you have Zachary Ty Bryan, who were both in TV shows at various times. You have Jason London, and you even have this odd appearance by John Doe, who is the co-founder of the LA punk band X, and he's Rachel's foster father, basically, and Rachel is played by Emily Bergel, so she's obviously the main focus in this. And I think the cast works pretty well for the kind of movie they were making, and the fact that it was a 90s movie, too. I mean, it was tail end of the 90s, but it still crept in there in 1999. So I think the cast was fairly solid, given what they were working with. And watching this movie now in the midst of the Me Too era and everything that's been going on lately, it's one that I think might resonate with its message a little more now than it did in 1999 when things like that weren't really being talked about the way they are being talked about today. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. Just a couple more note, like Rachel Blanchard, shout out to Are You Afraid of the Dark? She was in there. And then, like, Mina Safari was there, too. So I was, like, looking at this, I'm like, oh, like, you know what I mean? Like, this is a who's... And then, like, Eddie Kane Thomas, that's Finch from the American Pie movies. He was kind of like the outcast, like, kind of stoner dude in this movie. I agree with you. It touches on sexual assault, kind of like sexual shaming, the high school kind of subculture of, like, you know, like, women are just kind of like these objects, and, like, you know, things of, like, virginity. Like, it touches on a lot of that. And I felt like it was weird to me that the Carrie stuff was kind of shoehorned in. Like, I get that, like, if I felt like if you wanted to kind of remove that element, maybe this movie kind of play, like, on its own. Like, it's very timely for our time, which is, like, looking back on it, like, I didn't even realize that. Like, I thought it was gross then, but, like, now as I get older, I'm like, wow, these dudes are assholes. Like, you know what I mean? Like, the whole, like, thing with the school system, and, like, all right, well, like, you know, if he goes down, we go, you know, we'll name names, and, like, this will take us out of the big football game, and, like, all the, you know, kind of like Lisa Parker, which is Mina Safari's character, who commits suicide. And then, like, that weird instance where the guy with the video camera all the time, like, he like takes the video camera of her, like, dead body. It was like, oh wow, like, you could take that as a commentary on social media now. And there's so many, like, little things in this movie that I'm like, oh, okay, like, that's why it works for me, because it's a commentary on not only, like, the real life thing that happened, but, like, instances that are kind of being touched on now. And I feel like horror goes through phases, and right now we're in the midst of, like, an emotional horror phase, like with, you know, movies like Hereditary and The Lighthouse and things like that. And this movie, I mean, I don't know if people would consider it well done, but it actually does touch on those themes, which I thought was kind of like, oh, that's interesting.
And it's very in your face about all of these things. They're not sort of just trying to slip it by you. It's definitely sending out this message that, hey, this thing is happening. And, you know, I personally did not go to a high school where this was, like, super rampant, but I also went to an extremely nerdy high school, so maybe that's why. But it seems like things like that are definitely changing, and sometimes for the worse with social media. And this goes to show you how just years before social media became a thing, how rumors would get spread about people, and you didn't need things like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook to have these things happening, you know, when they go to the big party at the end. And I don't want to give too much away with that just yet, but they basically have this video that they're showing on the TV screen, and, you know, this kid is rich, so his family has some super fancy setup where it just blasts on the wall everywhere. And you're like, okay, so this is how things would get spread around back in high school in 1999, or, you know, whatever time period this actually takes place. I'm not 100% sure it's exactly 1999, but it's around that time because Sue Snell has had a chance to grow up, get a job, and she's the only survivor from the Carrie White incident. So you are led to believe it's at least 2 decades later, and you see the destruction from what happened in Carrie, which I think really resonates because you have the fact that in the book, the town just ends up being deserted and nobody does anything with it. And when you return to it in this movie, you're like, okay, that at least tracks with everything that King left us with in the book and then what Brian De Palma did with the movie. So you do get a sense that, yes, a lot of the Carrie side of the story is shoehorned in, but I do like the fact that they were at least bold enough to use original footage when Sue Snell was having, like, these kind of nightmare flashback moments.
Well, they initially were turned down of using that footage until, like, Sissy Spacek gave the okay. I think they approached her and, like, making a cameo or something like that. And I'm like, how are you going to do that? Because, Carrie's dead, but she gave the okay to like use her likeness, which was pretty cool. Going back to the plot point of like the Carrie stuff, there was a little weird thing that I thought what was going on, because like Rachel's mom, Barbara, she is basically committed to, well, I thought this was funny, she's committed to an asylum called Arkham.
Yeah.
Which is weird. So she saw Rachel's like telekinesis as a possession by Satan, and then Sue, when she takes her to like the original place and tells her about Carrie, she's like, it's not religious, it's a recessive gene trait that like, because Carrie's her like half sister. So I'm like, all right, well, it seems like this movie is telling two different messages. Like it's trying to retcon what I thought was the strongest thing in the original Carrie story, where like Carrie has this ultra religious mom, where like she like interprets Carrie's telekinetic gifts as like being won by the devil. But like we all know that like it's just Carrie kind of going through puberty and kind of going through her own, and just kind of, you can interpret like this like her becoming a woman, but like it's basically repressed rage that she's gained throughout high school. Like she had tampons thrown at her, you know what I mean? Like, and Rachel in this story is getting harassed by like this gang of dudes because like they basically had like this they do call it statutory rape in the movie, because the dude's 18, she's 16. So like to cover everything up, they try to basically harass her and gaslight her. Yeah, it's definitely two different types of stuff, but I think Rachel kind of stands up to it a little better. She's like, in this movie, she has a little bit more sense of herself. Like she's definitely like the outcast, but she's definitely like the like the middle finger F you type as well.
Yeah, I also think that in general, the fact that Jesse was honestly interested in her and it wasn't all this big ploy like it was in the original, worked a little better in his favor more so than in Rachel's. But it was one of those things where at the end there, you're kind of like, okay, this could go two different ways. And you do want to believe that he's going to get through to her. And he's not really like the other guys on the football team. And you see that from the start, too. It's not like they just suddenly flipped that switch and he was the good guy. It's like he was really good at football, but he also didn't want to be like the rest of the jocks. And you could see that tension coming through even before that big party scene.
There was like some weird instance where he was having sex with Tracy and like the guys are like cheering him on. I'm like, what the hell? Like, you know what I mean? Like, but I don't know. Even then, like he kind of regrets it. Like he starts thinking of Rachel, and like I started thinking with this movie, because the movie starts in a very like teen drama-ish comedy way, where like Rachel and Lisa like meet up on the bus, and she's like, like, does anything seem different? And she's like, guess right away. Where it's like, oh, you did it. It's like, oh, how did you? You know what I mean? Like, I guess you can just kind of know with looking at each other. This storyline, a very undercurrent of, I think, 10 Things I Hate About You, where like the jock or any kind of like 80s teen movie, John Hughes, where like the jock falls for the outcast, very like independent type girl, like it's, but he is with asshole friends who like perpetuate like this whole like basically like sexual assaultish, like women are like objects, jockish, like let's win like the big game type of friends. So like, yeah, it's I also, Zachary Ty Bryant, who's from Home Improvement, is also Eric. He's the biggest asshole in this movie.
Yeah, because Lisa honestly seemed to like him, and that was why she slept with him. It wasn't this thing that came across, when Rachel and Lisa meet on the bus that, oh, she was raped. So it was this thing that just turned really sour really fast. And because of that age difference, technically it was statutory rape because she did not reach the age of consent by law. And so he just sort of treats her like this object and dumps her. And that's what causes her to just literally walk off one of the buildings at school, which I thought it was a little odd that the high school had like a garden on the roof. That seems like something no high school would do these days, given the safety issues with it, obviously. And that sort of shows you just how much more lax things were in the 90s even. And you can tell that movies like this and real life instances like this probably perpetuated all of these different safety measures that we see in schools now. It's sort of like when you see some ridiculous sign telling you not to do something, and immediately you're like, oh, someone had to have done that for them to put that sign up.
Well, there are like two girls on the roof when Lisa walks up there to like jump off it, and they didn't think anything of it at that point. They were just like, oh my God. You know what I mean? Like, and everybody gathering around, it was kind of a little bit morbid. But at that same time, if somebody jumps off the roof, I think you would be a little shocked, even though like Rachel that's her best friend. She walks over and she touches the blood. When this sequence happened, like, I think there are some horror homages to this movie. I thought about The Omen, where like I think the nun jumps off and like hangs herself. She's like, Damien, it's all for you. Like I've saw a lot of basically like scenes that I've kind of seen before in this movie. From a production aspect, this movie's kind of a little jarring. And I know that, you know, there was an original director, Robert Mandel, who had quit, and then Kat Shea kind of like took over, and there was like 2 weeks of reshoots that went into this movie. When Rachel is kind of using her characters, there's this weird black and white thing that indicates it. Like, it's like she's using like this telekinesis thing, and there's also like this weird electrocution sound effect that happens. And I was just like, wow, like these cuts are really, really jarring and kind of weird. It's like, oh, all right, like,
and not in a good way.
Yeah, like you have to tell the audience that like she's using her powers. And in the original, like it didn't really happen that way. Like it was just like, oh, well, like it was subtle, like, oh, you know, Sissy Spacek's Carrie would just do it, and you're like, oh shit, like she could move stuff in her mind. Like you could see it coming here. And it was like, oh, that's kind of, like I said, it was like more of a made-for-TV movie type.
Yeah, it almost felt like one of the direct-to-video or, like you said, TV movie type of productions. And obviously when you have issues behind the scenes, that can happen, because I think Emily Bergel was cast in 1996 for this movie, and it didn't come out until 1999. And for something that isn't a super intensive CGI movie or anything like that, that's a very long production timeline, and it's because of those issues behind the scenes. But story-wise, you can tell there were some weird beats here and there, but overall I think the message they were trying to get across, not counting the Carrie stuff, was one that was new for the time. Not necessarily new, but it was just, like I said earlier, sort of a bold choice, the way they chose to do this movie. And, you know, if there isn't anything else you want to talk about with the plot, I think we can move on to that big party scene, because this is really sort of the crux of the movie when we really see everything go down, just like in the first Carrie movie.
Yeah, okay, so I was split on the finale, because there are very melodramatic music choices that are added here, like the very like piano, like when they're like when Rachel and Jesse are like confessing their love each other for the final time. The whole tattoo thing where like she starts to, you know, I guess like go crazy and start to kill everybody. Shout out to the kids who managed to get out of the house before like the doors closed. Like there were two kids who happened to stand in the middle of it, and as soon as the door like they slipped out. Like you said, like it with the prom scene in the original, it definitely mirrored that, except with like the weird cuts of the black and white of her kind of like in this trance of using her telekinetic powers to kill everybody. More so in the original, it was just kind of like death by fire, everybody kind of like burnt up. where she does some pretty brutal kills in the scene, like, you know, exploding glasses in the eyes, harpoon right in the guy's nuts, which is on brand for the movie because the guy, you know what I mean, like what he did to humiliate Lisa, yeah, that was kind of payback there. You know, getting shot with the flare gun, which I think that would have killed anybody else. But for a horror movie, of course it wouldn't happen. They definitely wanted a big third act climax here.
What do you think about Sue Snell dying the way that she did with the spear gun just going through someone, the door, and then her?
I mean, Sue, throughout the whole movie, she's our link between, like, character-wise, she's our link between the two movies. And she's honestly trying to do the right thing. She was trying to do the right thing by Lisa basically saying, like, no, we're going to try to prosecute this guy. Like, that's statutory rape. And she's trying her damnedest to basically not have this happen again because she saw what happened with Carrie. Like, you know what I mean? Like, Carrie basically killed 2/3 of the high school and then brought the house down. So I'm like, oh, like, damn, they killed her off just like that. Like, that was a little, I'm like, interesting choice. Like, I didn't think that she would be the one to die that brutally and instantly.
Yeah, I think my only issue with it was that Rachel never seemed to find out, so we don't get to see how that impacted her because Sue Snell had nothing to do with what was going on at that party. She was just trying to get her mom there so her mom could see her, and she does see her mom, and you kind of get that tense moment too, but she never finds out what happens to Sue, and you're kind of disappointed by that a little. But then you have this interaction with her and Jesse when part of the house falls on Rachel, and you're kind of like, okay, if she can make things move with her mind, why doesn't she just take that off herself?
Okay, I thought about this, and I'm like, one, if the piece of the roof falls on you or anybody, that would kill you, I would think. Like, you know what I mean? Like, she's already lost excessive blood loss by getting shot with a flare gun and falling into a pool, which, you know, pools blood from out of you. I guess they added it for, like, dramatic story effect. You know, the whole, like, you know, like, Jesse's trying to save her, and then he gets burnt, which is weird because he didn't... I mean, I guess in that aspect, you're just trying to get the piece of roof off of your girl, so you try to ignore it. And then she, like, you know, sends him away. And I was kind of with you, like, all right, well, if she can, like, telekinetically send off, like, a person into a pool, which didn't put out the fire, by the way. He still was burning. She could have done that she could have done that basically to the piece of roof that fell on her. Maybe she was too weak. Maybe that was the last thing that she could have done. Or maybe she thought she was too far gone where she basically murdered a bunch of people where she's like, you know, no more, I can't live any longer. So she just, I guess, let herself burn.
Yeah, kind of a weird choice, but in the end, it's like, okay, well, we didn't ask for this sequel to begin with, so we'll take whatever you're going to give us. And I think one of the other weird things was the tattoo. And I don't know if it grew because it was the one she got that matched one that Lisa had, and it was just showing how much rage she had from Lisa stepping off the building and killing herself or what. But you see it pulsing like a heartbeat. And because it's a heart-shaped tattoo, you're like, okay, that's still very, very weird. And then all of a sudden you get like these thorns on her face, and you're just like, all right, I don't understand the purpose of this, but you guys do your thing.
I think that it was very horror-ish. Like, the whole, like, thorns all over her face and everything. I took that as very, like... It was very 90-ish horror for that time. Like, it was like, oh, like, we have some CGI to use. Like, why don't we, you know, depict her going crazy? Instead of, like, you know, with Carrie, like, it was the blood, right? Like, it was the pig's blood. It was for the effect of, like, oh, shit, like, she's really lost everything. With her kind of, like, manipulating the tattoo, which is, I mean, I'm like, wow, like, telekinetically you can make tattoos stretch? Like, that's That's actually pretty cool. But I think it was kind of like the callback to the first movie with the blood. At least that's what I took it as.
Right. I mean, I like this movie enough, and I'm kind of trying something new with my rating system where I'm only going to use full stars, so I'm not going to do halves or anything like that. So before we dive into ratings, though, is there anything else you want to say real quick about the movie?
Like I thought it's better on the second initial watch that I thought the first time. Like I kind of dismissed it when I first watched it. But now that I'm more of a seasoned, I guess, cinephile, I would say, I thought that it was a little bit better. Like, especially with like watching movies and how we've gained basically tackling basically like the macho kind of aspect of high school and college. It's a good like depiction of that. I think, like, you know what I mean, like hold like this animalistic view towards women and like. It continues the beat from Carrie of like this innocence of like like virginity and like how kind of like sex is kind of sacred to Rachel and maybe not some of the other girls like Rachel and Lisa because like as she's kind of ridiculed by it like Lisa takes her life over it, so it shows like the importance of like sex and everything like that. Like I think with all the like Stephen King movies we've talked about, like I would cut this a little bit more slack, like especially because they don't have like with these sequels and in some cases like 5 or 6 movies going on. I'm talking about like Children of the Corn and maybe like The Lawnmower Man. I think there was a sequel for that too. I'm not sure, but there's no blueprint. So like for them to like basically interject like these concrete themes into it, which I thought was pretty cool. Like maybe like the Carrie elements could have been played up a little bit better, but they were sufficient enough, I think.
Absolutely. That's why I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5. Not that it's enjoyable like in a good way, because it's certainly a very doom and gloom kind of movie, but it just accomplished what it wanted to accomplish. And it wasn't the worst Stephen King thing I had seen, and it was not the best Stephen King thing I've seen by far in both directions.
Yeah, I'd agree. Like, I would probably rate it around same there. Like, if I rated it out of 10, I would give it like a 6. Or like kind of like you said, like a 3 out of 5. Like, there are some obvious editing issues. Like, really glaring cuts and things that are happening. And maybe it's due to the reshoots. But, like, they're, like, hard to ignore. But at the same time, like looking at this and looking at the themes, maybe I guess you can consider it kind of like a B horror movie. There are some like concrete themes here, like of like everything that we talked about, like with sexuality and kind of like high school and basically the culture around it, especially the culture around sports and like the jocks. And maybe we've seen the things before where like jock falls for like outcast girl, or like mean girls try to befriend outcast girl to like lull her into the false sense of security and everything like that. But like it does tackle some themes that we are definitely talking about now, and I give the movie some credit for having some foresight for that.
Absolutely. Well, Murjani, I think that wraps it up for us today, talking about The Rage. Carrie, too, thank you so much for coming on to discuss it. I know it wasn't one of our most favorite things, but when you saw it was open, you were like, okay, you haven't seen this, I need to discuss it with you, and I very much appreciate that.
It was a lot better than what like some movies that we previously talked about. Like, I know we've talked about, like, off podcasts, like, like, in rewatches, like, oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought. And yeah, I'm upon reach, I'm like, all right, cool, this is okay.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, and you'll be back on soon.
Oh yeah, of course.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.